I am extraordinarily honored to be here today and to be back in Sri Lanka for the first time since 2015, when I visited as a member of President Obama's cabinet. Sri Lanka has been a true partner of the United States, and I am grateful that many of the relationships that I was able to form while working with your country have endured, and indeed have become meaningful friendships. Right now, I am in the final weeks of finishing writing a new book. I've been working nonstop through many nights to meet my deadline. I don't even leave the house to buy groceries. But if there's one person who could get me to travel over 8,000 miles at this moment, it is Mangala. Mangala is one of the most extraordinary people I encountered during my 8 years serving in the US government, and indeed in my entire career. I simply had to be part of this momentous occasion. Those of you who know your guest of honor personally will not be surprised that when I asked him how I should approach this tremendous privilege of getting to deliver these remarks today, he said, quote, "The less said about me, the better," end quote. Now, considering that this is an event about Mangala, this was surprising to my American ears. I come from a country where, as President Teddy Roosevelt's daughter once said about her father, politicians want to be the corpse at every funeral, the bride at every wedding, and the baby at every christening. I have decided to compromise today. I will speak about what we can learn from Mangala's 30 years in politics about the central challenges of our time and how we must come together to confront those challenges. The three themes that I believe run through Mangala's extraordinary life's work are dignity, modernization, and democracy. So, in his honor, I would like to say a few words about each. The late fashion photographer, Bill Cunningham, once said, quote, "Fashion is the armor to survive everyday life." Well, Mangala seems to have concluded from quite an early age that the most meaningful way to spend one's days is to use one's influence to help people. And specifically to help people to not only survive daily life, to not only have that armor to survive daily life, but to help ensure that those people are able to build lives of dignity. His inspiration to get involved in politics, as you've heard, came in the late 1980s when the government was suppressing the Marxist youth insurrection in the South, and dead bodies were being hung on lampposts in his hometown. The son of a remarkably enlightened, trailblazing mother and a pioneering human rights lawyer father, Mangala thought to himself, maybe I can make a difference. Maybe I can make a difference. Mangala, rest assured, you have made one hell of a difference, and you are only getting started. When I asked his colleagues and his peers about his lifetime of service, the word that I kept hearing over and over again was dignity. Dignity, dignity, dignity. The belief that every individual is worthy of respect. The word, of course, comes from the Latin dignitas, or worthiness. The pursuit and the promotion of individual dignity seems to be the animating principle in Mangala's career. When I think of dignity, what springs to mind is the last civil rights protest that Martin Luther King Jr. was involved in before he was gunned down. It was in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968 when sanitation workers decided to go on strike to protest their poor pay and to protest the crushing to death of 2 workers in garbage compactors. The striking workers carried signs that you might remember even here in Sri Lanka. The signs said simply, "I am a man. I am a man." When I think of dignity, I think of Beijing in June 1989, and a slight man in gray slacks and a white shirt carrying 2 shopping bags who decided to confront one of the hundreds of tanks that were mowing down student protesters in Tiananmen Square. This Chinese man, seemingly on his way home from the supermarket, whom we have not seen since, standing before the turret of that tank, embodied the assertion of dignity. I think of December 2010 and a Tunisian fruit seller named Mohamed Bouazizi, who was so worn down by the humiliation and the corruption that he endured every day that he decided to set himself on fire in protest, sparking the uprisings that would cascade across the Middle East and North Africa, becoming the Arab Spring. And when I think of dignity, I think of the mothers that I have met here in your country, who clutch the weathered, faded photographs of their missing sons and daughters, begging people to hear their cries. Or the heads of household here, who needing money to feed their families after the war, relied on microlenders for small loans, microlenders who extorted them, charging spiraling interest that these families would never be able to pay back, an assault on their dignity. Respecting human dignity means not patronizing those who are less fortunate, those who are vulnerable, but listening to them, hearing the reality of their lived experience. Can put themselves in the shoes of others. If they can cross this essential imaginative threshold, we will have the motivation that we need to act. Mangala did this back in 1990 when he founded the Mothers Front with Mahinda Rajapaksa, creating a network dedicated to tracing down information on the disappeared and pressuring the government to provide compensation. Mangala is well known for taking the fundamental step of recognizing past abuses and of recognizing the critical need for reconciliation. As foreign minister, he spearheaded the creation of the Office of Missing Persons, which is now finally operational. He helped push a law through Parliament that will provide reparations for war victims and survivors. And more recently, as finance minister, he has orchestrated the forgiveness of loans taken out by those desperate families after the war. And he's just launched another debt relief program for those affected by the crisis of severe drought. As Nelson Mandela once said, quote, "Overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity. It is an act of justice. It is the protection of a fundamental human right, the right to dignity and a decent life," end quote. But the best measure of Mangala's regard for the dignity of those who have lost their loved ones or their livelihoods is that he knows that none of this, none of all that he has done, none of all that you have done is yet enough. It is the deficit of human dignity in our world today that explains so much of the tumult of our age. We ignore this deficit everywhere at our peril. Second, Mangala has shown his commitment, of course, to modernizing Sri Lanka. He has prioritized opening up this beautiful country to the rest of the world, including to my country, the United States. He secured the launching of the first ever US-Sri Lankan strategic dialogue. He announced in 2015 Sri Lanka's joining of the Open Government Partnership, and he spearheaded Sri Lanka's application to the Millennium Challenge Corporation through a long and tortured approval process. A dedication that is now paying off, as it will soon bring some $480 million in concrete benefits for a number of infrastructure projects in transportation and agriculture. Long before this recent phase in his career, as we've heard today, when he was Minister of Post and Telecommunications, it was Mangala who led the privatization of Sri Lanka's telecommunications industry. This progress has been absolutely essential as a foundation for economic investment and growth. However, for all of the good that we know technology can do, rapid advances of the kind we're seeing today in social media, in artificial intelligence, and in automation are also posing profound risks to our democracies. These tools are going to be decisive in global development going forward, we know that. But governments must also confront their dark uses alongside their boundless possibilities. I believe we need to dramatically increase our scrutiny of the effects of new technologies. Policymakers everywhere have to find a better balance than we currently have, a balance that takes into account the impact that tech is already having on politics and on human rights. In the United States, in the wake of Russia's interference in our election, and because of the deep divisions in our society, we are seized right now with the question of how falsehoods, or lies, and echo chambers enabled by social media impact our domestic politics, impact our lives. But these platforms, as you've seen here, also have potentially deadly impact when it comes to the rights and well-being of marginalized groups. The UN has found that the spread of violent hate speech and falsehoods on Facebook in Myanmar played what it called a, quote, determining role, end quote, in the mass atrocities perpetrated against the Rohingya. From the Philippines to India to Mexico to Indonesia, technology that barely existed 15 years ago is being used to scapegoat vulnerable populations, to exacerbate social cleavages to the point of violence, and to empower the most extreme voices. This is dangerous. Last year here in Sri Lanka, after hate speech and conspiracy theories about Muslims disseminated on social media helped lead to violence and destruction, one of President Siriseni's advisors made a profound observation that I think the entire world must heed. As he put it, quote, "The germs are ours, but Facebook is the wind," end quote. The germs are ours, but Facebook is the wind. Mangala himself was one of the first political leaders to take to Twitter during the crisis to condemn the viciousness, sending a clear message of zero tolerance to politicians and others who incited racial violence. In societies like ours, like the United States and like Sri Lanka, societies with mixed ethnicities and religion, with free speech and extreme voices, we must urgently confront these dangers. I cannot overstate the impact of social media platforms going forward. Despite going worldwide, again, just so recently, Facebook now, today, has as many adherents as Christianity. Thinking about it another way, since I used to be ambassador to the United Nations, at its height in 2018, in terms of profits, Facebook was worth more than the economies of 167 countries in the United Nations. There are only 193 countries in the United Nations. That's more than 85% of the nations in the world. Here in Sri Lanka, apparently, some 6 million people regularly use Facebook. This is surely going to grow as mobile technology becomes cheaper and more widespread. Asia, as we know, is already the company's fastest growing market. And when you include the total percentage of people who also use WhatsApp, YouTube, Twitter, and even newer platforms, you are talking about a significant portion of the population. When it comes to companies like Facebook, Twitter, and Google, which failed for too long to grapple with the dangerous uses and effects of their products, it does now finally seem that they are seized with the abuses that their platforms have helped enable. Excellent investigative journalism, public outrage, and the threat of regulatory oversight have helped. But these companies need to prioritize contributing to the health of democracy as a goal, right alongside making yet more money. I was encouraged to hear that Facebook has committed here in Sri Lanka to serving up to 20,000 Sri Lankan children in a digital literacy program that will be run this year. And apparently they are participating in the Information and Communication Technology Agency's Smart Social Circles initiative, which aims to prepare people to better discern, as Mangala puts it, the good from the bad and the true from the false. This is important. The education and leadership of well-rounded, tech-savvy, and civic-minded young people is going to be critical to reining in the negative effects of these new technologies. But, given the human consequences, what is being done is a drop in the bucket. We need to think far bigger. In my country, I would like lawmakers and policy leaders to think about a number of approaches. Instituting regulations and heavy fines for failing to remove hate speech, for example. Greatly restricting the ability of advertisers or nation-states disguised as advertisers to micro-target users with messages designed to mislead and enrage. Rethinking the type of anonymity afforded to users of these technologies so as to cut down on the spreading of lies with impunity. And probing seriously whether some of these enormous tech monopolies that could have their own seat on the Security Council, they're so big, have become so dangerously large and, in their way, so dangerous to open society that they need actually to be broken up. Governments like yours have an essential role to play. You are going to have to insist that Facebook uphold its so-called community standards for all of Sri Lanka's national languages, or that those companies will face serious repercussions. It is deeply problematic that Facebook has not invested more here in equipping itself to monitor posts in languages like Tamil or Sinhala. A platform that has this much influence and reach cannot get by just doing the bare minimum. Facebook needs to be far more transparent so that experts and civil society can guide the company to how to do better in the context of the unique challenges that you face. As always, thinking about technology is complicated. Many countries would like nothing more than to have the grounds to regulate social media and the internet so as to enhance censorship and surveillance, not to protect their people, but to protect themselves from scrutiny and accountability. Indeed, repressive governments already are increasingly able to use technology to control and manipulate their populations. Women in Egypt have been tracked down and arrested for sharing their experiences under the Me Too hashtag. The Mexican government has infected the phones of local journalists and members of civil society with sophisticated spyware that allows them to capture every text and conversation. Turkey, a member of NATO, currently blocks access to 100,000 websites. But I think what Mangala's career shows us is that we in public life have a responsibility to take into account these human consequences, to look at our tools with human consequences in mind. At all of Mangala's stops along the way, he has demonstrated how public policy can be crafted to address societal ills that others would prefer to ignore. The tech companies will not change unless those with power, all of you, all of us, make it known that you care. Third and finally, Mangala has not only been a believer in democracy and the institutions that are the cornerstone of our respective systems, He has himself worked to strengthen those institutions. He has been, in his way, an institution unto himself, a one-man check and balance. I'm not sure what is on the bestseller list here in Sri Lanka, but in the United States I can tell you that people are buying books with titles like 1984 by George Orwell, How Democracies Die, How Democracies End, The People versus Democracy, Can It Happen Here? Authoritarianism in the US, which actually my husband edited, Fascism, A Warning, by our former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. These books and the feeling that democracy, this value that Mangala has stood for his entire career, that democracy is in retreat. These books do not come from nowhere. This book taste that we've acquired does not come from nowhere. It is moored, this taste, in some disturbing trends. 13 straight years of freedom's decline around the world, according to Freedom House, which has documented that, in fact, it is in consolidated democracies where the worst setbacks are showing up. Overall, 68 countries suffered net declines in freedom in 2018. This is on measures like individual rights, freedom of expression and belief, and the rule of law. Instead of rule of law, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace has documented how more than 70 governments in the last 10 years have instituted what you might call rule by law, taking a number of serious measures to restrict civil society, from legal measures like regulation to straight up intimidation. There are no silver bullets when it comes to democratic trends like these, but fatalism cannot be the answer. But unfortunately right now, a confidence gap seems to have overtaken large parts of our world. You see authoritarians kind of strutting around, even though their model rests on very fragile foundations. Democratic leaders, meanwhile, in many cases, seem to be running for cover. When I graduated from university in 1992, a book about the global triumph of liberalism, Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and the Last Man, had spent a month on the bestseller list. Its thesis, as many of you remember, was, quote, that there is a common evolutionary pattern for all human societies in the direction of liberal democracy, end quote. That was the thesis. People loved it. They went crazy for it. They embraced it. Today, people have begun speaking of democracy's decline with the same certainty they once spoke about democracy's inevitable universal triumph. We must not make the mistake of replacing one triumphalist narrative about the inevitable spread of democracy with its doomsday opposite. Recent events within established democracies like the United States are a wake-up call. We cannot take for granted all that we have taken for granted. The durability of liberal institutions, the status of science, and attachment to facts. But if you look at most autocracies and what lies ahead in terms of their ability to deliver for their people, I believe each of us would choose the resiliency and possibility for self-renewal that democracy offers. And recall, despite the worrying backsliding that I've described and those trends in terms of freedom in the last years, if you look at all four of the most widely used and accepted databases that assess democracy over time, the percentage of democratic countries in the world right now is at or near the all-time high. You will unfortunately hear very few Democratic politicians making these points, but allow me to summarize the essence of the argument. Democracies have the better model. In autocracies, economic growth is likely to be impeded by stagnant state-owned enterprises and a lack of transparency in the economy. Even in China, growth is slowing. And one wonders how secure investors will feel over time with the arrest of expatriates and the absence of due process and property rights. Autocrats often overreach because they don't hear from critical voices in their inner circles, and they often prefer, let's face it, the company of sycophants. If you or I worked for a strongman, would we be eager to be the bearer of bad news to our bosses? That's an impediment to democratic progress. In the military, the most capable officers in autocracies may be less likely to rise than the most loyal. When you have no term limits or put in place a president for life, it can breed decay. While innovation is flourishing in some sectors within certain autocratic or authoritarian societies, we have reason to question whether innovation will be undermined in the long term by the absence of freedom of speech and the presence of fear. And finally, one of the biggest factors explaining the appeal of illiberal or populist leaders is inequality and the feeling of many that they are being left behind, the dignity deficit. A trend that will increase, we know, across the world with growing automation. But there is no reason to expect that autocratic or authoritarian systems that concentrate power at the very top will more equitably distribute benefits than liberal democracies. I do not mean to understate the challenges of maintaining truly democratic societies. My country and your country are facing turbulent times. The last time I was here, I would never have guessed that an American president would attack the judiciary, the press, women, minorities, diplomats, intelligence professionals, law enforcement officers, and many of our closest allies. You didn't hear me give that speech. I didn't expect that. In the United States, many of the ills that we face, the intense inequality, the big money in politics, gerrymandering, restrictions on voting rights, corruption, polarization, racism, and exclusion. These issues have raised serious questions among Americans about how functional our democracy is in the 21st century. Sri Lanka has recently experienced its own political crisis, which raised alarm bells all around the world. But critically, while our respective institutions have bent, they are not breaking in the United States, and they are not breaking in Sri Lanka. In the United States, journalists have done an extraordinary job investigating corruption and calling attention to the abuses of power. In a number of cases, dogged reporting has led to resignations and exposed terrible wrongs. After doing almost no oversight for 2 years, our Congress has just been reinvigorated. There are more than 100 women in the House of Representatives for the first time in American history. More young people and women and minorities are running for office than ever before. And our state and local governments have taken a stand on many pressing issues, from climate change to immigration to voting rights, issues that the federal government is failing to address with any seriousness. Here in Sri Lanka, you all are the experts, but during your constitutional crisis, your citizens made themselves heard, with many of them speaking not for parties, not for particular personalities, but in defense of your hard-earned democracy. Your streets were home to the country's first ever spontaneous popular protests, not initiated by any particular political party. Proving, by the way, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis' great wisdom that, quote, the most important political office is not that of president, but that of private citizen, end quote. One woman here who participated in a protest commented, quote, as a mother, as a grandmother, I want to see democracy restored. I'm not against any person or any party, but I am a citizen of Sri Lanka, end quote. Another said, quote, we're doing this for the next generation, for the future of this country, end quote. Both traditional and new media outlets here were able to play a key role in keeping Sri Lankans informed and keeping institutions accountable. Civil society, and again, both new and established groups that have been around a while, were active and effective. And your judiciary stood by the Constitution and enforced the rule of law with great independence and seriousness of purpose. All of this is a credit to the resilience of Asia's oldest democracy and to the checks and balances that Mangala has championed over the years. I hope that for both of our countries, the response to the challenges that we are facing will end up affirming the enduring strength of democratic institutions and the necessity of democratic accountability. Your hope, Mangala, that Sri Lankans, quote, create a civilized society where humanity and decency flourish and the rule of law is respected, end quote, is what I hope for both of our countries. And I look forward to the continued friendship between our two nations as we work to make that happen. Allow me to conclude with a little history. Around a century ago, German sociologist and economist Max Weber was invited by a liberal student association at the University of Munich in Germany to deliver a series of lectures. Now, picture the scene. Germany had surrendered in the First World War not long before Weber delivered one of his lectures, which he titled Politics as a Vocation. And he delivered this lecture on January 28, 1919. So, almost 100 years ago. The utter destruction wrought by the First World War, the human destruction, the physical destruction, the moral destruction, was unprecedented in its scale. It was not a time of confidence in the capacity of politics to be a force for human progress. It was surely one of the more difficult times and places in which to make the case for politics as a vocation. Yet, against that backdrop, Max Weber set out trying to answer, in his words, quote, what kind of a human being one must be to grasp the spokes of the wheel of history, end quote. What kind of person do you have to be? Weber laid out 3 independent qualities, each of which he considered indispensable to the vocation of politics. Those 3 qualities were proportion, responsibility, and passion. Proportion, in Weber's view, was about maintaining the appropriate distance from a policy decision in order to be able to analyze it rigorously and objectively, and to bring a necessary degree of humility to one's ability to shape the world. Responsibility involved remembering to think through the likely consequences of proposed actions and interventions, regardless of how well-meaning or logical the motivations behind them. Passion was what Weber defined as a kind of inner gravity, the driving force behind one's convictions. At the end of his lecture to the students at the University of Munich, Weber declared the following: our entire historical experience confirms that what is possible could never have been achieved unless people had tried again and again to achieve the impossible in this world. The only man who has a vocation for politics is one who is certain that his spirit will not be broken if the world proves too stupid or base to accept what he wishes to offer it, and who, when faced with all that stubbornness and resistance, can still say, nevertheless, despite everything. That's Weber. We are not coming out of a harrowing world war but Lord knows Sri Lanka suffered a brutal 26-year civil war that ended so very recently, just a decade ago. And all of us are living in times that can test our faith in politics. And yet I am as convinced as ever that despite all of the cynicism out there, our strength will rest where it always has, in those individuals willing to serve and the convictions that they bring to the human endeavor of politics. Individuals who see the flawed world as it is, but who are willing to say, nevertheless, and strive to build a better world. Mangala is one of those individuals, and I join you today and all days in thanking him for his 30 years of service. We all know that the best is yet to come. Thank you so much.